Changemakers, and welcome to The Core, sponsored by Red Apple & This is your Everything Education podcast. We talk about current events, books to read. We interview education leaders, hear their stories, learn from their biggest lessons, and they share what they wish you knew about what it means to be in education today. I'm your host, Dr. Kia Turner. Buckle up for small seeds of inspiration that can lead to big changes in your classroom practice. Let's take a bite out of today's guest. This week, we're talking about how to create a truly inclusive classroom. And in fact, I'm calling this week's series Inclusion 101. For those of you who know me, you know that I love all things school and teacher. However, I definitely am not an inclusion expert. Because of that, I thought it'd be great to do some interviews this week. So every day that you tune into the show, you're going to hear from a different expert how to make your classroom an inclusive place. That way, you're hearing from more than just me, and you're able to connect with people who are doing the work on the ground right now. My first guest needs no introduction, but I'm sure several of you know her, many of you here in the Midwest. Lisa Benson is a former television news reporter who was removed from her job after sharing a post on Facebook about white fragility. She turned around, successfully sued her former employer, and took the entire experience and decided to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. She went on from what would have been a traumatic setback for many people to earn her certification in diversity, equity, and inclusion from Cornell University. She took everything that she learned there and became a speaker, trainer, and advocate for diversity and inclusion. She does media training for people. She talks with PTA groups and schools about creating inclusive learning environments. She champions inclusion at her own kids' school, and she does a host more things to make sure that the voices of people of color are elevated in every single space. It's always good when Lisa and I get to sit down. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Lisa, we wanted to talk to you today about how to make the classroom a more inclusive place. Like, we know that inclusion has a lot of different things, right? We're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about ability, we're talking about a lot of different things. When you are going around and highlighting best practices in inclusion, how do you determine where to start?
Well, I think the opening line, the opening conversation has to be about belongingness so that everyone in that classroom belongs as though he or she belongs to be in that classroom, irregardless as to their racial background, their gender, their ability, their disability, that there is a place for them in this space. And so, as I often say, I know teachers have a huge responsibility when it comes to trying to make legitimate, genuine connections with every student in their classroom, but that is absolutely the task. That is absolutely the goal. And so with that genuine, authentic connection, that child feels as though he or she belongs in that classroom, that he or she matters in that classroom. So I think that's where inclusion has to begin. It has to begin with an authentic connection.
I love that, and I think that is absolutely true. And I've shared with you, look, offline and on, that the feedback I get from teachers a lot of time is, listen, there are more kids than there are of me. I don't know how to get in touch, with who they are outside of school. And if you don't, look, you need to go to Engaging Parents 101, because there was a whole series we did on this show there. But also, I don't even know how to get to know the kids in class. So what we're hoping today is that you can give us some tips for making our classrooms more inclusive. But since there's so many lenses, give us just one lens to use, and then 3 tips for how to make sure we're making strides towards inclusion.
Well, I think one space that we have to deal with that we don't like talking about as a culture is race, because we have cultural experiences that align with our own specific cultural experiences. So if I grew up as an African-American female in small town Missouri, that is my racial lens. That's the way I see my world. Yeah. And so if that's true for a child in my classroom, lucky for he or she. But if that's not true for the child in my classroom, then I'm going to have a harder time to connect. So it is my job as the educator, it's my job as the adult, it's my job as the leader in this classroom to figure out ways of making authentic connections with students who did not have the same social, cultural upbringing that I had, whether good or bad, because there are students who very well may have had a better upbringing, if you will. They had more privileged upbringing, but you still have to make that authentic connection so that that child feels as though he or she can bring his or her best self to the classroom.
I love that. And so a lot of teachers do this. I know you guys have heard it, and there's just no way to overstate it. Even if you do like beginning of the year surveys with students, we have a guest on the show coming up later this week who talks about just asking the kid one thing that they're interested in. There are a lot of ways for you to build this connection with your student, but a big part of it begins with being open to seeing them as people. Like, you need to understand that they're more than just the children in front of you, right? Like, these are people with their own unique ideas, unique preferences, likes, dislikes. And when we start to see them as someone we get to know and not just kids that we need to like download instruction into, then we'll get further in building our relationship. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the feeling of belongingness will cultivate an openness to learning in the student. Ooh. But I also believe that openness to learning has to be true for the educator as well, because they have to be willing to learn.
Say that again. Openness to learning must be true of the educator as well. Continue. Yes,
absolutely.
Lord.
Absolutely. So in that, again, that authentic connection, you get to talk to your student about their life, what they're experiencing at home, what their family like, what they enjoy doing, who are they? Because there will be things about their own individual cultural experiences, their ethnicities that you honestly don't know. But if you're curious and you ask questions, the children are willing to share. They want you to know. They want to make the connections, because in this classroom, and understanding that the educator, the teacher, spends more time with that child than probably their parents do. So how much more will they want to make that connection and feel as though they matter to you and want to share their real life with their real life teacher who has so much governance over them, so much authority over them. And then these students have a love and an affection for. And the other part that I think we often sleep on is a legitimate caring. You absolutely have to care. You have to want the outcome to be better. You have to look at this child and want this child to have the same educational opportunities, the same growth opportunities as a child who may have grown up in your same cultural space.
Or as a child in your family.
Yes, absolutely. If you can't look at that child and hope for that student the same that you hope for your daughters, sons, nieces, and nephews, then maybe that's not the right space for you. Maybe there's another academic setting that will better meet your needs, because in these schools, your job as the educator, as the teacher, is to meet the needs of these students. And so hard questions, tough answers, can you meet the needs of these students? And are you doing the work so you can meet the needs of these students in this classroom, in the school in which you are working? That's a question that you have to ask.
We got to stop you because you're moving into Inclusion 102 and we are not there yet. But I love that you said it because it's absolutely true. I like that there's a duality there. Like, are you able to meet the needs of the children here, and do you care about them? Because those are two separate things. I could care about them and still not be able to connect. Do you know what I mean? I could be like all concerned that everybody does well, but I can't get to the connection needed to move student achievement. And I absolutely love that. Okay, so point number one, to make sure that your classroom is racially and culturally inclusive, is to build positive relationships with your students. And here's an easy suggestion for that. So I told you all that I spent the summer working with middle school kids back in the classroom because I just need to make sure that I'm really about this life that I talked to you about. And I will tell you what we did was make a list of our favorite YouTube channels. And so something simple, let's say you have brain break time, pull up one of their favorite channels. I found out about people like CJ So Cool, the Prince family, the Ace family, Nikocado Avocado, B Loves Life, all these YouTube stars just by talking to kids about what it is they watch on YouTube. Then I just incorporated those videos where possible into our brain breaks or those characters and their storylines into our work. So there's one way, right, to build positive relationships no matter where you're from. All right, what's a second thing that we can do to make sure our classrooms are culturally and racially inclusive?
I think as educators, we have to be ready to have tough conversations in the classroom about uncomfortable topics. Be ready to create teachable moments in awkward spaces. Because again, when we have these culturally diverse classrooms and we live in a space that does not readily embrace conversations about race, about gender, about sexual identity. There are a lot of conversations we're just not comfortably having that unfortunately just reality says educators will confront in the classroom. So be ready to create teachable moments. So when you encounter a child calling another child out of his or her name, when you encounter inappropriate touching, inappropriate contact, whether it's a child making odd comments about a young girl's hair because it's not like their hair, be ready to respond to those moments. Be ready to make them teachable moments, because a lot of times these students in these new environments, because they are growing up in racially homogenous areas too, because their neighborhoods may not look like
Kansas City. They probably are.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. And so be ready for that. Be ready to correct the behavior in such a way that the offender is learning and that the person who is receiving the bullying or the negative comments, they don't feel smaller. They don't feel as though they've done something wrong because they're not like the other student. But I think it's important for the teacher to be ready to respond to the situation and create teachable moments.
You know what? I'm so glad you said that, because I will tell you that I know for teachers, it's easy to say, y'all just stop. Y'all stop. Y'all be kind to each other. Is that the way we treat our friends? But we're not dealing with what just happened there. And when we don't, it makes the classroom feel less safe for the student that was most impacted. And so it's like, dang, I mean, you told them to stop, but you didn't really do anything to advocate for me
and to
say that I'm okay.
And it doesn't stop it from happening again. And then we're dealing with so many family dynamics that are changing now because of the society that we live in, which is a good thing. We're embracing diversity. We're embracing inclusion. We're embracing the LGBTQIA community, which is a good thing. But that means in that classroom, they have to feel as though they belong there too. And so what happens oftentimes is othering. It's like, you're not like me, you're something different. And so again, these students feeling as though because their family dynamic is not the same as hers or his, maybe they're not the same. They don't belong here. And so again, it's our job as educators to make sure these students feel as though they belong here. A space was created for them and it's a safe space.
I love that. Okay, so if you are counting, we're up to 2 tips. The first one is to build positive relationships, and those help make your class racially and culturally inclusive. The second one is to make sure that you look for teachable moments. So when you see students do something that's offensive or say something that's offensive, or when you sense that there's an attitude that shuts students out because of their difference, you have the opportunity there to turn that from everybody needs to just get along into a teachable moment and to talk through whatever the misconception can be, so that students understand that everyone comes to the classroom with their own intrinsic value. And there's nothing that's going to diminish that. Every person, no matter their experience, has value. And that's a message that you can convey by addressing things directly and teaching kids through it. What's your third point? You got one more? Tell us.
No, actually, I think this is a perfect segue into the boys and gender stereotypes, because so often, historically, I'm sorry?
You saving that one for next time. We're doing a part 2. Go ahead.
Okay, well, so often when you talk about the history of education in our country, these classrooms were built for young white girls, and these students are being educated primarily by white women. And so oftentimes little boys don't quite feel as though they fit or they belong, especially the energy in which that is just birthed into them. So a huge part, I think, of that inclusion includes creating spaces so that these students feel as though they are able to be themselves inside of these classrooms, inside of these spaces.
I love that. I think that pop culture is where maybe a lot of teachers see their difference with themselves and their students, you know what I mean? Or cultural norms and values, maybe. And so maybe I would say, because y'all hear Lisa trying to segue into part 2. Part 2 is her talking about creating classrooms that are inclusive by gender. I do appreciate you saying that teachers need to make space for everyone to be themselves, whoever that is. The other thing I would say is that teachers need to gain an appreciation for all students' cultural norms. Does that make sense? I was recently with my niece at her volleyball game, and there was a girl there who had tattoos all over her thighs, right? They're in middle school. And so it's unusual in American culture for like an 11 or 12-year-old girl to have full thigh tattoos. Well, it turns out that this student's culture merited her getting full tattoos. It was a part of I think she was from Samoa. And so it turns out that where she was from, girls got that as a sign of respect for their elder. She had an elder in her family who held a high position where they were. And as a sign of respect, her mother actually had her get that done, and she wore those proudly. And so understanding then where, in just that small exchange, who she was, where she was from, and what was valuable to her, helped me to appreciate her even more as a person. And I think that teachers need to do that in class. Maybe create space for students to talk about what's important outside of school. Do you know what I mean? Who they are outside of school, how their families live, how their families communicate, what their lives look like, so that everyone comes to understand that people are more than what you see in one place. And that's okay. What you think?
Yeah, and I think the basic definition of inclusion includes a quality social connection and an openness to learning, which means that exchange was exactly what happened there, because this child is old enough to engage, this student is old enough to engage, talk to her. And I'm sure she'd be more than happy to explain, because now she has an ally in the classroom. Because if you, as the educator, the teacher, you're sitting there looking at her thigh tattoos thinking, what's going on here? So are other classmates, which means she's going to feel smaller and smaller, and as though she does not belong in that space because no one is like her. But if she feels comfortable enough and connected enough to share her authentic self in that space, and now that creates so many opportunities for legitimate conversations about a culture that otherwise other students may not be exposed to. But again, that inclusion, that belongingness, that openness to learning has to be in play for those conversations to manifest. If not, she sits in the room and feels as though people are staring at her, and they probably are, and you're sitting there with questions as the adult, and you're not initiating that. So I would suggest a one-on-one conversation to understand her level of comfortability, and ask her if she's willing to share. I would bet good money that she would be willing. She would be open to sharing herself with her classmates, because she too wants to make connections and belong in that classroom, in that school.
I love that, and we are going to have to stop here for this episode. So if you were counting 3 tips for making your classroom racially and culturally inclusive. Number 1, cultivate positive relationships with your students. Number 2, instead of skipping over misbehavior and misconceptions, you need to turn those into teachable moments. And then number 3, create space for students to bring their authentic identities into the classroom and allow them to share those. That is all we have. You guys need to catch Lisa on part 2, which is going to be creating inclusive classrooms for gender, making sure that all genders feel included in your classroom. That is actually coming. So be sure you check us out tomorrow. If you guys liked hearing from Lisa, you can reach out and contact her. She does PTA trainings, school trainings, one-to-one coaching as well. She's available at lisabenson.org. So if you're looking to increase your inclusion knowledge, get a group of parents on board with understanding how to make your school an inclusive place, or to train a staff of teachers in best practices with inclusion through all kinds of lenses, you definitely need to reach out to Lisa. I'm going to put her website in the show notes. That is all we have for today. My loves, go forth, fire starters, be great, and stay lit.
That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to The Core. Wherever you are listening to us, be sure to like our show, subscribe, and share the episode that's meant the most to you. We appreciate every single one of our subscribers, as do our sponsors. We look forward to seeing you next week. You can also check us out on YouTube at Red Apple Edco if you'd like to see more video of these conversations. We have them posted there.